Olá, tudo bem? Hoje estou com o coração pesado, pois o Paulo Henrique Amorim, um grande jornalista, uma lenda do jornalismo mundial, faleceu. O Paulo é uma figura que eu conheci 2 vezes, quando foi entrevista a ele, apoiando uma equipe de emissora de televisão estrangeira, Al Jazeera. Depois do primeiro encontro com ele, eu comecei a mandar alguns e-mails para ele, a gente trocou algumas ideias e ele virou a primeira jornalista brasileira para compartilhar minhas matérias do Brasil Wire em português, sempre com palavras bastante bondosas. E por isso eu sempre vou ser grato para Paulo. Eu vou sentir muito a falta dele, né? Principalmente nesse momento da conjuntura brasileira, porque tipo assim, foi conversa afiada e 247 eram as únicas forças na mídia social brasileira suficientemente grande para bater com essas mídias da ultradireita, né? Porque você via a lista dos 10 matérias principais da semana nas mídias sociais, sempre tinha alguns 2 ou 3 da conversa afiada. Não, a conjuntura vai sentir a falta dele, a gente vai sentir muito a falta dele, então descanse em paz, Paulo. Eu estou aqui ainda no Ithaca, New York, interior do estado de Nova York, onde eu fui visitar minha mãe depois da minha participação no Forum Left em Brooklyn, representando o 247. Eu vou mostrar 2 matérias para vocês hoje. A primeira é uma matéria do The Real News. Alexander Zaitchik é um jornalista jovem, muito talentoso, estadunidense, que passou 3 meses no Amazonas agora, visitando reservas indígenas, conversando com ambientalistas, para fazer uma matéria investigativa sobre o desmatamento na época do Bolsonaro, que está aumentando muito rápido. E o resultado disso foi uma matéria no Intercept, e nessa entrevista do The Real News ele conversa sobre a situação. Como eu já falei para vocês, eu estou em Ithaca. Ithaca é um interior que também serve como sede de uma das universidades mais importantes do mundo, Cornell, onde estudam várias figuras brasileiras importantes, alguns de bem e alguns de mal, como eu já falei. Por causa disso, eu decidi procurar um professor daqui que ensinou alguns brasileiros conhecidos, né? E eu encontrei bem brevemente com Dr. William Goldsmith. Bill, como ele é chamado, foi no bancada do tese e dissertação do Plínio Arruda Sampaio, José Serra. Ele trabalhou muitos anos com Carlos Weiner, da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, Departamento do Planejamento Urbano. E eu encontrei ele brevemente para conversar, só que ele não se sentiu muito confortável falando sobre a conjuntura atual no Brasil. Ele tem 78 anos e faz alguns 15 anos desde ele viajou para o Brasil e ele está perdendo o português dele. Então, numa entrevista breve, mas ele falou algumas coisas importantes, porque como ele é, de fato, um dos gigantes no mundo acadêmico do planejamento urbano no mundo, a resposta dele às medidas do Bolsonaro de tentar tirar Paulo Freire do sistema educacional, essa ideia de militarização das escolas, eu acho que é importante para a conjuntura também. Então, espero que vocês, todos e todas, gostem desse programa e um abraço da Ithaca, New York.
It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert in Baltimore. The policies of Brazil's right-wing president, Jair Bolsonaro, is placing the Amazon rainforest under extreme threat once again. For a while, from 2004 to 2016, the Amazon's destruction had been slowed and even partially halted. However, ever since Bolsonaro has taken over as president, the rainforest destruction has been accelerating again at a frightening pace. According to Amazon, a Brazilian research center, deforestation in the first months of 2019 increased by more than 50% relative to the same period in 2018. Most of this deforestation took place illegally in protected areas. The Amazon is an ecological system that is essential for the world's climate. 20% of the world's fresh water cycles through its rivers, plants, soils, and air. and about 20% of the rainforest was already destroyed in the course of the 20th century. If another 20% were to be destroyed, which could happen in less than 30 years, it would trigger a vicious feedback loop that scientists call dieback. This is what happens when the forest begins to dry out and burn on its own until it disappears completely. Joining me now to discuss the impact of the Bolsonaro government on the Amazon rainforest is Alexander Zaitchik. He's a freelance journalist who has covered indigenous issues and land conflicts in Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil. His most recent article was published in The Intercept and is titled Rainforest on Fire: On the Front Lines of Bolsonaro's War on the Amazon, Brazil's Forest Communities Fight Against Climate Catastrophe. His investigation and the article were supported by the Pulitzer Center. Thanks for joining us again, Alex.
Good to be here.
So before we get into the policies of the Bolsonaro government, give us a brief overview of how the Brazilian government has dealt with the Amazon rainforest before Bolsonaro became president.
Well, there's really two distinct phases. There is the period up until the transition to civilian rule in the late 1980s. And that entire period, which covers the modern history of Brazil, was basically one of either indifference or extremely aggressive attempts to develop the region and bring, quote unquote, civilization to the rainforest, to settle it, to develop agriculture, to log it, to mine it. And that triggered runaway deforestation that really wasn't brought under control until about 2004, as you mentioned. And beginning in the late 1980s, there were attempts put in place to preserve the rainforest. There was an understanding that was happening not just in Brazil but around the world that climate change was related in a very serious way to deforestation, to the carbon that was released when the forest was burned. And the agencies that are now being dismantled were set up, primarily IBAMA and ICMBio, the conservation agency in Brazil. There were satellite systems put into place, which the Bolsonaro government is now trying to privatize. All of the efforts that resulted in the slowing and eventual stop to the runaway deforestation unleashed in the 70s and 80s basically are now being, all those attempts are being rolled back across the board. It's hard to think of any initiative that Bolsonaro has not gone after. And it's gotten to such a point where even the Norwegians, who have done the yeoman's work of trying to keep momentum going forward in Brazil, are talking about pulling support for the Rainforest Fund, which is $1 billion fund that they and certain other, mostly European countries, started to make sure Brazil was not on its own in dealing with this international crisis, which, as you mentioned, has profound implications for the health of the Earth's biosphere.
Well, let's dig a little bit deeper into this. I mean, as we've had you on before, actually, a couple of months ago, and it was already clear back then that, and also already when Bolsonaro was running for president, that he has complete disdain for the Amazon's protection. Now, in what ways exactly has he fulfilled on his campaign promise to open the Amazon for development?
Well, it begins with signals, very important signals, even during the campaign that he sent to the illegal economic actors that are hiring the chainsaw crews that are now, with the beginning of dry season, beginning to burn the land that they've cleared. And basically those signals were very, very clear that said, we will not be from this government. And we're now seeing the fruits of that. Some of the early data that we got in the beginning of winter, which you mentioned, were scary enough. But now we're getting information with regard to the dry season, which is not just 50% up, but 90 and 100%. We're seeing double the rates of recent years. And the satellites, it's worth noting, can't even capture the worst of it because all they can really see is outright deforestation, and they catch the plumes sent up by the burns. But what you find on the ground, and this is why the indigenous communities that I wrote about in that piece are so important, they're sort of like satellites on the ground. What they can tell you about is forest degradation, forest fragmentation, the smaller cuts, which show you the trend lines into the future. They can show you what's happening under the canopy, which is often as important as the outright clearance of the canopy. And the agencies that were put in place to monitor this stuff on the ground alongside the indigenous communities and other traditional forest communities are being defunded, they're being destaffed, they're basically being restricted from doing their jobs. In the most famous instance, in the Jamari National Forest, IBAMA agents were told personally by Bolsonaro in a video he released not to destroy. They were prohibited from destroying equipment that was requisitioned in the forest, which is their main deterrent, actually. I mean, the fines they give have always kind of been jokes. Almost none of them are ever paid. But when heavy machinery is destroyed in situ in the forest, that's a serious deterrent because this is quite expensive machinery, regardless of who's funding the operations. And Bolsonaro is actively holding back IBAMA agents from executing the one power they have to actually deter this kind of activity in protected areas. It's like I said, it's across the board. I mean, you can go through any of the agencies and show basically how it's been gutted and how people are being kept back from doing their jobs. FUNAI, the Indian agency, is operating at a drastically reduced capacity. Often you have field stations in the middle of the Amazon with one FUNAI agent who's responsible for a vast territory of escalating social conflict and violence. And the idea that they're going to be able to fulfill their duty to help the indigenous communities monitor and protect their land is, it's not realistic.
Now, the Amazon is known not to be very good for growing crops because the soil is not very fertile. Now, if it's not good for growing crops, what are the material interests behind the Amazon's deforestation?
Well, it's not good for growing crops, but you can grow things in the soil for short periods of time. You can grow forage for cattle, and then through pesticides and more clearing, expand that ranch territory, and you can ranch on that ground, as we've seen over the last 50 years. But it requires constantly expanding to make up for the depleted soil. Same thing with soy. I mean, you can farm on it, but it requires heavily industrial, poisonous methods of farming. And of course, there's logging. There's a lot of trees in the Amazon that are worth a lot of money to the international lumber trade, which, despite a lot of efforts in recent years, is still not close to being one that is monitored or certified in any sort of credible way. The certification regimes that we've seen in the last 20 years are full of holes, and they're very easily gained. So people who think that they can choose, good rare woods and hardwoods out of the world's rainforests are sort of kidding themselves. So obviously there's a lot of economic activity that pays off. The problem is it requires a huge environmental trade-off, and most of it is short-term because, as you mentioned, the soils are not very good. And the reason the rainforest is so abundant with life, and always has been, is because of the canopy, which is constantly falling, degrading, deteriorating, and releasing nutrients into the soil. And when you remove that cycle, these very thin layers of dry soil and clay die very, very quickly.
In my introduction, I already pointed out the Amazon's importance for fresh water. Tell us more about the role that the Amazon plays in the global ecology and what its destruction would mean for that ecology.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate. I mean, the amount of water that flows through the Amazon is estimated to be a fifth or more of the world's supply of fresh water. And that's not just the rivers, the famous Amazon and its 2,000 feet of rivers, but it's also the moisture in the begins to break down, then those river systems will begin to dry up, and so will the atmospheric moisture that cycles throughout the world as well. And the implications are profound for our ability to grow food, which is already being obviously put under great amounts of pressure with climate change.
Well, yeah, and actually, one of the things that the Amazon is known for, or is called sometimes, is a carbon sink. It absorbs carbon dioxide. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, and also what that would mean if it were actually to burn off the existing carbon that is already basically sequestered currently in the Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant process. Rainforests are always absorbing carbon. They're always releasing a certain amount. It's not just a carbon sink, but it is large enough that it is a net carbon sink. And that is now being reversed with the clear cutting of more of the forest. You have generations worth of carbon that is released, and it's released immediately when these trees are cut or when forest begins to degrade. And again, the degradation is almost as important as the clear cutting, and the degradation is not picked up by the satellites. So you have to take the satellite data with an asterisk because there's other stuff happening in the forest. And should all of that carbon be released in the form of a sort of rolling systems collapse, like you mentioned in your introduction, it would be the equivalent of, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it would be like 100+ years worth of industrial activity. Just a carbon bomb. I mean, it would be the closest thing you could imagine to, a carbon doomsday bomb on par with the permafrost or other big feedback triggers that people are warning about right now. It's up there with the big stuff.
Now, what needs to happen for the Amazon to be saved? I mean, in terms of, in the policies in Brazil, and what are the indigenous and ecological groups of Brazil doing in that sense?
Well, the first thing, most immediately, would just be to enforce the laws already in the Brazilian constitution. There are laws regulating how much deforestation can take place in protected areas and non-protected areas. And that foundation should be immediately respected and provide the baseline for further regulation. That is not happening. The agencies that are being gutted should be expanded. They should be empowered to do their jobs. More people should be hired, not fired, which is what's been happening under Bolsonaro. The tribes who are on the front lines of these struggles and provide often the buffer between larger tracts of forest and the so-called economic frontier, they should be assisted to do the work that they've been doing for so long and want to continue doing and are now doing alone. They've been abandoned to monitor these ancestral forests themselves, which is a very dangerous thing to be doing when you don't have state support. And murders have been a big part of the story and unfortunately look set to increase. And that's a risk that they're very bravely willing to take. When I was down there, it's very inspiring to hang out with these people and see how much danger they're in and how much danger they're willing to accept for them and their families to try and protect what they understand to be an international commons. And more broadly than that, I think there's a conversation that's beginning to take place that I think has to deepen and accelerate the sooner the better. And that's the conversation about whether this 8 billion person global economy based on growth and consumption can be massaged into sustainability, which is a very dubious proposition. And I think we need to really start thinking about different frames, different organizing principles for our way of life on this planet.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there for now. I'm speaking to Alexander Zajac, freelance journalist and author of the Intercept article, Rainforest on Fire, which I highly recommend for everyone to look at, and we'll link to it with our story. Thanks again, Alex, for having joined us today.
Great to be here. Thank you, Greg.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.
I was there for a full year, 1982, 1983. I taught economics at UNB. I substituted for Cristóvão Buarque, which was interesting. And then I taught economics at Cayenne, the Center for Perfectionment of the Economists of the Northeast in Fortaleza, for a semester. Then I worked for 20 or 30 years with various groups in Brazil. I taught an American summer school in Brazil, in wintertime in Brazil, for 4 weeks every summer for a number of years, together with Carlos Weiner at the Federal University of Rio. I've kept in touch, and in Cornell I had 20 Brazilian graduate students, all of whom were absolutely marvelous. 2 of them were Plinio Sampaio, who you all know, and José Serra, who you also all know. They were brilliant, brilliant students. I can't comment on their politics in Brazil because the subtleties escape me. I miss Plinio dearly. He was a wonderful man. That's that. My expertise, though I spent a lot of time studying Latin American economic development and the differences between Latin America and the United States, and I've worked a lot in Italy as well. My expertise is in American cities, and particularly on inequality and racial affairs in American cities. My focus in all this work has been the way in which the growth of American cities, aided and abetted by federal and state policy, by political decisions, by budgets, has served to sort of rigidify the differences and the inequalities that separate poor Americans from rich Americans. The key element of the difference in the levels of service between the city and the suburbs, between the rich parts and the poor parts, is the quality of the schooling.
I'd like to tell you a couple things that Bolsonaro is doing in education and see what your reaction is. He's announced that they're going to purge everything related to Paulo Freire from the public education system. He's outlined government funding for sociology and philosophy, and he's opening up the possibility of military running public schools in some areas, military police and regular military. Do you think those, from what your limited time in Brazil and whatever, do you think that will help the school system in Brazil at all? Or do you think there's other solutions that would help people do better at school?
I don't think that'll help. My time was sufficiently long enough to understand that. My kids actually went to school in Brazil in Portuguese, both in Brasilia and in Fortaleza. I think the idea of military schools is insane. That's not how you teach. I was in the Army. I went to school in the Army. It doesn't work. You don't learn much. You learn to pass the test the way the Army wants you to pass the test, but that doesn't necessarily teach you very much. Paulo Freire was an incredibly innovative school philosopher, school organizer. Paulo Freire's method for basic literacy, especially in Spanish, but also in Portuguese, works. It's well demonstrated. His idea about learning about things that really matter to you makes phenomenal sense. What matters to people, adults, is politics. What matters to children is other kinds of things, but the same method can be used. That seems crazy. Not teaching philosophy and sociology sounds to me, I don't really know, like a way of avoiding political criticism.